Welcome to One Work, 5 Questions with Donna Wythe, that is I, and Dr. Mark Holowchak, that is the other person that you see on the screen.
And we're going to try this again after we had an abortive session earlier today because my computer. But I moved everything around. I moved my computer room, my study into the gym, and my gym into the study. So I should have better reception. I don't know if I'll have better workouts, so we'll see what happens.
Well, yeah, we can't hurt the workout. We need the workout. Yeah. You're working out for both of us. Well, today's episode is Thomas Jefferson to George Wythe in a letter dated the 13th of August, 1786. But before we get started, I'd like to read Dr. Holowchak's credentials. Dr. Holowchak is a PhD professor of philosophy and history who has taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. He has published 26 books, right?
Just got one accepted yesterday. So the one on Native Americans, I'm proud to say, I'm very proud of that book.
Oh, wow. So 26 books. I have a bunch of cross-outs here. Since we first started the show, you've written 6 books in the time we've been doing the show. And he has over 200 essays on Thomas Jefferson. And you can find the location of the essays and his books in the video description that will be on YouTube. And for those of you, hi Cornelius, joining us on Spaces on Twitter, I will have the video as soon as we're finished. I'll upload it and it will be in the comments of when I retweet this space. So then you'll be able to see any visuals we have that we're doing on the video. You'll have access to it and you'll be able to see Dr. Holowchak. Okay, wonderful. Well, let me give you a little introduction to our episode today. It's Thomas Jefferson's thoughts on education. The last episode, we promised to turn to some discussion of Thomas Jefferson's thoughts, plural, on education.
I have a book on that too, Jefferson's Philosophy of Education.
Is there anything you have not written?
There's a lot I haven't written on. I haven't written a book on my dog yet, or a lot of different things. But
you can call it the other Jefferson.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I don't think I'll do it. Go ahead.
So today we're going to examine a letter from Thomas Jefferson to lawyer George Wythe. So I am Donna Wythe, and this is One Work, 5 Questions. Are you ready for question number 1, Dr. Holowchak?
I guess so. Let's rock.
Okay. Question number 1. You told us last week that Wythe was one of the most significant figures in Thomas Jefferson's life. Who was George Wythe, and why? Why was he so singular?
He was a figure very dear to Thomas Jefferson because he was is an older gentleman. He was honest, sincere, truthful, and Jefferson mightily looked up to George Wythe. Wythe was born in 1726, Jefferson 1743. So there was a 17-year difference between the two, and Wythe was, in effect, a father figure to Thomas Jefferson after the passing of Peter Jefferson, when Jefferson was still a boy, still a very, very young man. Wythe was a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. He was a lawyer, a Virginian judge, a founding father, signer of the Declaration, and he was the first professor of law in the country. Thomas Jefferson assigned him that post. So when Jefferson studied law at University of Virginia, there were 3 ways to really become a lawyer. One is to go to England and study there. Another would be to have an apprenticeship, which Jefferson had with Wythe. And the third was just to study on your own. And so Jefferson was apprenticed with Wythe. That wasn't even a joke, with Wythe, right? But the notion was, I think the apprenticeship certainly was, it's usually what would happen is the lawyer would have the apprentice do a bunch of menial tasks, and Wythe wasn't like that. I think he just let Jefferson do his thing, and he helped him out a little bit here and there. And Jefferson just studied on his own. But anyways, he was a self-possessed person, a cynosure, a role model for Jefferson. He wound up being poisoned by George Wythe Sweeney, who was his sister's grandson.
Okay.
And that's how he came to his death. Jefferson wrote of him in his autobiography, his pure integrity, judgment, reasoning powers gave him great weight. That's who George Wythe was.
Thank you, Dr. Holowchak. Question number 2. Okay. As was the custom of the time, many preliminary issues were discussed. I begin with Thomas Jefferson's excitement of the Bill for Religious Freedom. What does Thomas Jefferson have to say about reception of that bill in Europe?
Well, that made him, Jefferson was a big celebrity for his declaration and other things that he wrote. The Bill for Religious Freedom gave him even greater celebrity. And he says, somewhere in the body of the letter, he says, our act for freedom of religion is extremely applauded. The ambassadors and ministers of the several nations of Europe resident at this court have asked of me copies of it to send to their sovereigns, and it is inserted at full length in several books now in the press, among others in the new encyclopedia. That's probably the Encyclopedia of Diderot. I think it will produce considerable good even in these countries where ignorance, superstition, poverty, and oppression of body and mind in every form are so firmly settled on the mass of people that their redemption from them can never be hoped. I like this. He says, if the Almighty had begotten 1,000 sons instead of one, they would not have sufficed for this task. Right? All the sovereigns of Europe were to set themselves to work to emancipate the minds of their subjects from the present ignorance and prejudices, and that as zealously as they now endeavor. The contrary, 1,000 years would not place them on that high ground on which our common people are now setting up. So he's all excited. We know that he one of the 3 accomplishments on this gravestone is that he authored the Bill of Religious Freedom. It's having a remarkable effect. And if Jefferson does not have remarkable global celebrity at the time, he certainly has it now because of this Bill for Religious Freedom.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, and we do so love that bill. Okay, question number 3. Thomas Jefferson then segues into discussion of education, and he does so in a manner that suggests that religious freedom is of less significancy than education. Do you agree?
Well, let's look at what he says here. After he finishes, he says, to know the worth of this, he talks about, I think by far, he says, the most important bill in our whole code is that for the diffusion of knowledge among the people. No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness. If anybody thinks that kings, nobles, or priests are good conservators of public happiness, send them here. So, right. So the idea is yeah, he comes right out and says this is the most important bill. So the education of the masses. I mean, he talks of that. He talks of riddance of primogeniture in entails. In other words, inheritance laws, Bill for Religious Freedom. In this, he talks of these as needed reforms. Now, when I say needed, he certainly thinks this is more important. But if all these reforms are needed, you can't say A is more needed than B. If I'm making chicken soup and chicken has to go into it, and say carrots have to go into it in a particular recipe, I can't say chicken is more necessary than carrots. They're both needed. So you can't quantify necessity. But yeah, he says that. He says, that educating the masses is more important than the Bill for Religious Freedom. I don't take it, again, I say I don't take it that seriously. I just think they're both necessary for him. He thinks they're both critical and important.
Okay. Well, we do remember one of our episodes talking about Thomas Jefferson on education and stating that education was important for the health of our country. The better educated the masses are, the healthier the country will be in terms of dealing with internationally and dealing with government.
I'm out of peanuts.
You're you're out of peanuts. Okay. Question number 4.
No, but you're right. That's yeah. Education is, especially for Jeffersonian Republic, education is, I say it fits hand in glove. It's like putting a glove on a
Right.
hand. You know, they fit together neatly.
Right.
Did you sneak in another question there, by the way?
No,
That's-
no. I'm just thinking of just the health of American citizens, to how education plays a role in fighting tyranny from the government.
Yeah,
And
and we are so, we value education so much today, don't we? We really do.
Yeah, that was sarcasm, right?
We really need to learn something from Thomas Jefferson with respect to education. We just don't. We're slipping in so many fields we don't value today. All right, what's question 4?
Okay, question number 4. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson is not merely talking about education. He's talking about general education. Could you again walk us through the levels of education for Thomas Jefferson and the significance of general education for a Jeffersonian republicanism?
Yeah, there are 3 levels of education: education of the masses, reading, writing, arithmetic, and American history and things like that. And for those who want to go on to the highest level education, there are the grammar schools, we call the colleges. We call colleges, universities, roughly at the same level of education. For Jefferson, the grammar schools were the second tier, or the colleges, he called them. And that's where you just study, you'd focus on languages. And then a third tier is higher education, like William and Mary, University of Virginia, where at University of Virginia, Jefferson had elective education. You can study, you can take your own course, study the things that you think you needed to study, and get out of there with that. Jefferson didn't hand out diplomas in that regard, but you studied what you needed to study. But I have a few quotes here, and I'm not going to read all of them, but just he says it to James Madison in 1787. Say finally whether peace is best preserved by giving energy to government or information to the people. This last is the most certain and the most legitimate engine of government. Educate and inform the whole mass of the people, enable them to see that it is their interest to preserve peace and order. They will preserve them, and it requires no very high degree of education to convince them. The notion being that if you don't educate the general citizenry, they're not going to be as readily be able to see the corruption, because people who are in office for any amount of time tend to think less of the people, and they start thinking more of themselves the longer that they're in office. And Jefferson thinks this is a general thing for all people, for most politicians stuff. It's
well, we see it
problem.
today. It is. It's how many years later, hundreds of years later, and we see it happening today. The dumbing down.
Of course, it happened in Jefferson's time, and John Adams' solution to that was to have checks and balances. In his discourse on Davila, he talked about you got to have checks and balances because you can't trust the people. But Jefferson thought you could trust the people because they had a moral sense and people were generally good. People like Hamilton and Adams thought, well, I don't know if I agree with Jefferson. People are greedy, they're stingy, they think of themselves. So you have to have checks written into the Constitution, into the system. Jefferson didn't really think that. Jefferson thought that we need to educate the people so that they can recognize corruption. And, if the people are allowed to, if the people act in pursuance of their moral sense, things will be fine. Okay, in 1779, he publishes his bill for the general diffusion of knowledge. He says the most effectual means of presenting the perversion of power into tyranny are to illuminate as far as practicable the minds of the people. And then in the same bill, he says, at the Virginian public schools shall be taught reading, writing, and common arithmetic. The books which shall be used therein for instruction the children to read shall be such as will at the same time make them acquainted with Grecian, Roman, English, and American history. So the idea here is to teach them reading, writing, right? And arithmetic and the reading and writing, for the most part, should be giving them all sorts of incentives um, pursue knowledge of history later on, right? And I add one other quote, because this is a very important quote. A lot of people will say that Jefferson, Jefferson's bill for the more general fusion of knowledge, and a later bill he introduced where he wanted to bring his 3 tiers of education system in, both never passed in Virginia. And so he went on to work on the University of Virginia, and he had trouble, getting that through, but he did. That was successful. But his system of education, there never was a system of education at the time in Virginia, probably not even in America. So he wasn't just trying to reform education. He realized you had to have a system.
Mhm.
You had to think through the whole thing. You had to understand what the whole thing was for. So there was a whole philosophy, political philosophy, based on, the happy life. But he says in a letter to Joseph C. Cabell, who was a senator from Virginia and who helped Jefferson get the University of Virginia started, he says, were it necessary to give up the primaries, general education, or the university, I would abandon the last, because it's safer to have a whole people respectably enlightened than a few in a high state of science and the many in ignorance. This last is the most dangerous state in which the nation can be. The nations and governments of Europe are so many proofs of it. Now, in Virginia at the time, there was education for the rich, for the gentry, for the aristocracy. It wasn't an aristocracy like you had in Britain, and especially not in France, but the wealthy people had their children educated. And they, of course, were massively opposed to general education because they'd be taxed for it. And Jefferson said, if we reform the whole system, then taxation that for all the reforms I'm proposing will be less costly than education the way we have it right now. But the rich didn't want it because they didn't want their kids to be going to these quote unquote public schools. They wanted their kids to be mentored by someone whom they knew. So the rich were thinking, the wealthier people were thinking, well, if this goes through, I'm going to have to pay taxes to educate other people, but then I'm not sending my kids to these ward schools. I'm going to have them tutored by someone whom I know. So they worried about sort of paying twice for education, and it never passed. And but something like public education is what we have today, right? And Jefferson really was an instigator of that.
Wow. It's so amazing to see their foresight from the 1700s to now. It's like they had a crystal ball and they could see what the world would be like. It's amazing the foresight they had.
I don't know, there was no crystal ball, but that didn't happen. But what Jefferson had is he understood what you want to come up, Jeff?
Hi, Jeffy.
There he is, right?
We have the real Jefferson joining us.
Well, there was, like I said, there was no crystal ball, but Jefferson had a political philosophy. And you want to come up here?
That has stood the test of time.
But that political philosophy mandated certain reforms to education, right? If you're going to have education of and by the people, you have to have an educated citizenry. End of story. There's no other way to describe it. Because in a matter of speaking, look at how education has been, in Jefferson's day, prior to any sort of reforms and stuff. It's the wealthy people who have their children educated. When their children educated, what happens to them when they come to be adults? They have all the most important jobs, and the money stays in the family, as it were. So the wealthy remain wealthy, as it were, because they're the ones getting the education.
Right.
And there's no opportunity for people who are less wealthy to move up in the world. And Jefferson, thinks that's very, very important for him, that all people have equality of opportunity.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Equality of opportunity. That's what's important. Are we ready for question number 5?
I guess so.
Okay. What are the problems Thomas Jefferson underscores with the gentry of France and England?
He talks of the people of England towards the end of the letter. He talks of France. He says, the people of England, I think, are less oppressed than here. He's talking about France, but it needs but half an eye to see when among them that the foundation is laid in their dispositions for the establishment of a despotism. Nobility, wealth, and pomp are the objects of their adoration. They are by no means the free-minded people we suppose them in America. Their learned men, too, are few in number and are less learned and infinitely less emancipated from prejudice than those of this country. An event, too, seems to be preparing in the order of things which will probably decide the fate of that country. It is no longer doubtful that the harbor of Cherbourg will be complete, and that'll be a most excellent one and capacious enough to hold the whole navy of France. Well, he's going on to some political matters here, but the idea here is that both France and England lag behind. The oppression of the poor people in France is extreme and great. The oppression of the people of England is less than in France, but not that the same as in the United States. And that's very, very important for Jefferson. So that's it.
Oh, that's it. Oh, I know you had quite a lengthy answer for question number 5. I thought there was more.
No. That was 4. I warned you that number 4 would be. I'm trying to clean off the camera. I had a lot of stuff going on, moving, and then I had my pull-up bar that I use. I had to disassemble that, take out all the nuts and bolts and put it back together. And it was not quite chilly outside, so I worked up a bit of a sweat after a pretty intense workout. And so the reception seems to be better in this room, and we'll see what happens, right? But
it's great. You're coming through clearly. Your visual, the audio, the visual, the
but
video.
Am I making any sense? Do you see my Larry Lobster T-shirt here, right from SpongeBob? Larry's a pretty tough bird here.
So I'd like to bring our guests to to our next episode, which will be an 1814 letter to Thomas Law. And I selected this letter because in my Florida Civic Seal of Excellence course, we're learning about the things that influenced our founding fathers to create the country, the Constitution that we have today, and to create the country as they saw fit. And in one of my sections, we were talking about the different enlightenments that influenced our founding fathers, and a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Thomas Law came up, and that discusses the moral character, moral sense. And I was so fascinated with the letter. I said, can we do this? That's why I wanted to do that letter next. So that's what we'll discuss next week. Hopefully on Thursday, we can get back on schedule.
Well, it is. I'm surprised that in coursework they would suggest that. And I wonder if the people who suggested that be part of the reading understood the extent to which it really just is a letter where Jefferson talks about what the moral sense is, and without really any gross political implications. But nonetheless, I could say from my perspective, being a philosopher, it's one of the most important letters Jefferson has ever written, because it tells us more than just about anything else he's ever written, what the moral sense is, how it works, what it's not. And I'll say by means of a teaser, he talks of things like this letter has led to various interpretations of it in the secondary literature by scholars. And I'm going to nail the letter perfectly. I mean, he talks of what is the foundation of morality? Can there be a moral atheist? And I have a friend of mine who says, well, Jefferson talks about a moral atheist, so he thinks that morality doesn't include love of God. To be a moral person, you don't have to love God. I'll show that that's not true. And then Jefferson talks of utility being the standard of moral correctness. And he says that almost literally. And I'll show that he doesn't really mean that literally, and I'll explain why. That would lead to sort of moral relativism. It is a perfectly, wonderfully important letter. And I hope we can get it done in a 40-minute session. I think we can, but
well, if not, we can have part 1 and part 2.
Yeah, but it's just, well, we'll try it. And it's just a fascinating letter because it can be interpreted in a few different ways. And I'm going to show that there's only one way to read it. And I'll nail it for everybody. So if you really
I think you
want to
nail
look
all of them, Dr. Holowchak.
No, this one especially.
There's no one that knows Thomas Jefferson better than you. I mean, you've literally devoted your life, your free time, everything to studying his writing, his work, his life. And until somebody has spent the amount of time dissecting and studying someone, they cannot make a thorough assessment as you have, because they don't have the knowledge you have. That's
it's work.
Yes, you have to put the time in. You put the time in.
You keep reading and reading while other people are eating s'mores and watching Oprah reruns,
or doing karaoke. That's
or whatever people do.
That's me. So
I like to you do the reading. I'm not that young anymore, and maybe at some point soon I'm not going to be doing so much more. I mean, I'm going to be I've written a book on Ukraine, and I might be doing more. And I don't know how much more work directly I'm going to do on Thomas Jefferson. 26 books are quite a few. And the book, the Native American book that I've written, got accepted yesterday. I'm very pleased with it. It's a very, very good book, very good book. So I'm very pleased that that's getting published. And I just got, The World Without Thomas Jefferson hasn't found a publisher yet because it's historical fiction. And I don't think of it as historical fiction. I think of it as me doing the best I can to imagine a world
without
this world. If Thomas Jefferson had never been born into this world, what would it have been like?
Maybe you should change the title to Erasing Jefferson.
No, I hate that because it has the political implications, which you saw. And I don't, this book has a political angle, I guess, but I don't want to make it a political book. I just want people to read it and see if the world that I describe, if it seems like a plausible world. And then it's up to the reader to see whether it's a better or worse world. I think clearly Thomas Jefferson did so much good in this world that it's hard to understand thinking that he could be never born into a world and the world would somehow be a better place had he never been born. I just don't see that.
So we cannot eliminate his existence. So if you'd like to contact Dr. Holowchak for a seminar, he can be a guest speaker virtually or in person. You can reach him at mholowchak, HOLOWCHAK @hotmail.com, or on Twitter. His handle is at Dr. Holowchak, and that's DRHOLOWCHAK. Or you can reach me at my Twitter handle at Donna Vitek 1776. Or his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. And that is a wrap, Dr. Holowchak. I'm looking forward to next week, and we still have some. We have some guests on Twitter that are attending from Twitter Spaces. We have about 8 minutes left. If anybody would like to say anything to Dr. Holowchak, if you'd like to speak, you can request to speak, and we can I can turn up my phone so he can hear your question. We usually don't have time for this, but
But keep it related to education, so we stay within the
yeah,
framework.
right.
I would add, if anybody's interested in copies of some of my books, I can have autographed copies, but just email me at mholowchak@hotmail. We can talk about that if you're interested.
Okay. Okay. Yes, you can email him for an autographed copy. Dojmart and JW, thank you for joining us from Twitter Spaces. And if you, like I said, if you have a question before we close out the show, if you'd like to request to speak, we'll take your question. Anything to do with Thomas Jefferson's thoughts on education. If not, we'll go ahead and close out the show, and I will upload the video and put it in the comments of this space so you can watch the video of it. We did have a couple of visuals in this, not as many as we usually have, but we had the statue of George Wythe and the schoolhouse from back in the 1700s.
Well, we'll have more depending on the work that we're dealing with, which we're dealing. Next week, there's a lot of confusion, and I might go into the secondary literature and show how people have, in my estimation, wrongly interpreted some of the passages there, and we'll do that. Okay. So we'll give you and if we can't cover the whole thing in one session, we'll do 2 sessions. But it's a really, stay tuned for next week. It's really going to be a fun time. If you're philosophically inclined, if you like analysis, if you like to read something and break it apart, try to figure out just what does it mean, and it'll be fun. It's one of my favorite letters in the Thomas Jefferson corpus. So I'm glad you picked up. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holowchak. We are so lucky to have the benefit of your experience, your knowledge, your time.
I've got my picture of Thomas Jefferson on the wall back there. Can't see it because it's the sun's going down, but
oh yeah. Oh, I see it now. It's coming through. Yeah.
It's coming through. Yeah. It's so it's a little bit of mayhem here. We'll try to figure that out. I'm all flustered with my beard manager. I pulled some of the stuff out on the side. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Life is perplexing. Life is perplexing. It's okay. So next week, letter to Thomas Law, and Tata TTFN. Tata for now. We'll do this again.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Holowchak.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, guys. Thank you for joining us.